in a few different times just to kind of get a real deep color. And then kind of go in here at the bottom.
Warhammer 40k Darktide is the kind of thing that makes me wish I was more of a 40k fan than I actually am. It's the latest game by developers Fat Shark, Swedish devs responsible for the popular Warhammer Vermintide series. 2 games about running around in a team of 4, killing hordes of enemies set within the Warhammer universe. The only difference is this time around with Darktide, instead of killing humanoid rats, fast forward about 40,000 years into the future and you're now killing humans infected by a Chaos God. That's not to say Darktide isn't as good as Vermintide is. In fact, I actually found this game way more appealing to play through. Mostly, I think because of the balance it has between melee and ranged combat. Vermintide felt like it was taking a melee approach to the horde shooting genre, which is fine, but now Darktide feels like it's an evolution of that, making the ranged combat as fun, but more importantly as effective as the melee. And yeah, I am nothing if not a huge simp for a good shooter. Now before I get too far into this, I do want to say I'm not sure if I'd call this video a proper review. I played the pre-release beta for about 20 or so hours, focusing on the Zealot Preacher the entire time, and I only managed to get this guy to level 23 out of 30 levels in total. And in the time I wrote and edited this video alone, they've added in a brand new mini-boss, not to mention mission mutators. So I'm not really too sure you can say you're reviewing this game unless you've spent at least a comparable amount of time with each of the other 3 classes, post-launch. So I guess my point is that this is more like an extended impressions video and also something of a redemption after the reviews I did for Vermintide 1 and 2. Videos I rushed out faster than your mum rushes out a paying customer when their half hour's up.
Oh my god, okay. Chill.
Either way though, I don't consider those 20 hours wasted, and although I feel like I've only scratched the tip of the iceberg with this thing, you know, playing it before it's even fully come out, this is still some of the most fun I've had with a co-op game in 2022.
No more trouble in that one.
Alright, so before I get too far into the video, let me quickly thank my sponsor, Bespoke Post, and tell you about their subscription service, which gives you access to monthly boxes of awesome top shelf goods from under-the-radar brands. Every month, members get introduced to all of these cool new products, be it outdoor gear, home and kitchen goods, clothing, or even more unique stuff like live produce. Yeah, one of the boxes is named Fresh Catch, and this one sends you a whole range of fresh seafood right to your doorstep. Or you've got stuff like the Weekender bag, which was one of their most popular offerings apparently, to the point that they ended up bringing the whole thing back. Yeah, this thing's a really solid, stylish and efficient travel bag that lives up to its namesake. It's a lot different to those old monthly loot box subscriptions, because the stuff you get in these boxes is actually useful and not the kind of stuff that just ends up at a garage sale. The kind of boxes you get is based off a preference quiz, and each box of awesome has around $70 worth of value, which is really only a fraction of what these things are actually worth. What I think's even cooler too is that the lineup is also changing every month. And before they ship one of these things out to you, you'll get the option to preview what's inside. You know, so you can decide if you want to keep it, swap it, or just skip that month entirely, all at no extra cost. In fact, you know what? Joining doesn't cost you anything either, and if you decide you want to cancel, well, there's not going to be any extra cost too. And you know what? If you don't want to keep any of this stuff for yourself, well, there's always going to be birthdays and Christmas to look forward to. And if the looming threat of Mariah Carey is anything to go off, let me tell you man, Christmas is definitely going to hit us in the face sooner than we realise. So if you want to get in on this and get 20% off your first box of awesome, well, head on over to bespokepost.com/GmanLives20 or use the promo code GmanLives20 at checkout. Right, so regards to the class you play as, the whole thing always starts off the same, with your character getting busted out of prison when a bunch of chaos cultists attack the ship you're on. You're then given a pardon by the Inquisition so long as you agree to work alongside them to investigate the motives of this cult.
There's a lot of work to be done. A lot.
I will say though a lot of this stuff is all new to me, and I'm not the world's biggest 40k fan. My only real experience with the franchise is the old Space Marine game back on the PS3, which I played to death, and also being mates with a couple of guys who were really into Warhammer back when I was in high school. But you know what, even as a pretty casual fan here, I gotta say this is a pretty dope story. You know, the story that gets presented anyway. And I say it like that because the way I describe Darktide is that it's heavy on lore but light on story. That's to say that if you go off and marvel at all the 40k details they've crammed into this thing, well, there's going to be no shortage of stuff here to cream your pants over. But on the other hand, if you're expecting lots of main and side characters and cinematics where you listen to hours of diatribe or comic relief, well, that ain't really what's happening here. I mean, at least not yet anyway. Who's to say that stuff won't come out in the future? What you've got here is a harsh and unforgiving world, which I guess is kind of what 40k is in a nutshell. A world that's barely being held together, locked in this perpetual battle with the metaphorical forces of hell. And I'm not really a religious guy in real life, but even I find the hyper-religious world and lore here to be really awesome. I mean, it's a world that you can easily get lost in, especially when it looks as good as this one does. Welcome! I think the ogre and characters in this are about the most soulful thing I've seen in a video game in recent memory. I love too how you can often see them trying to count their fingers during the loading screens. But yeah, just don't expect to be bogged down in the details here. Not that that's a bad thing though, and there is kind of something refreshing about a game like this. I mean, consider we're now living in an era where video games just often outright tell you what a puzzle solution is. Not to mention large segments of a game are little more than just interactive narrative sequences. Yeah, where you're force-fed the narrative. Darktide has key cinematics when you reach certain player levels, but that's about it. It's a story that just progresses on in the background, and you're really doing a little more than just trying to get everyone to take you seriously.
Let me give you a tip. You want to make your mark here? Prove yourself. Work hard.
And that's kind of the end game to the story, is to just not be viewed as this expendable bag of bones. Think it's kind of funny that just around the 8-10 hour mark was when one of the side characters said I finally had their attention. Yeah, after 18 hours.
You now have this unit's attention, Acolyte. Continue in this fashion, and I might find a use for you.
How do you get the Inquisition to take you seriously? Well, you complete missions. And the only goals you get out of really having to complete those mission objectives is just to reach that next key level. The mission screen presents you with like a dozen or so different missions to play through, missions which rotate over time and have different parameters to keep them unique. From having constant hordes to deal with through to the map being entirely pitch black. You're being sent into the hive city of Tertium, hives being these vast, abandoned underground cities overrun by the forces of chaos. And the sheer scale of some of these environments, combined with the overwhelming number of hostiles, paints a picture on just how hopeless your efforts are. I didn't spend a huge amount of time playing through Vermintide 1 and 2. I mean, I think I beat the main story missions and then I pretty much called it a day. But even with the limited time I spent with both of those games, it was obvious they weren't for the weak-willed. And that's something it feels like they brought across here too.
Jesus, yeah, fucking hell.
So if the sight of literally dozens of enemies charging at you seems like the kind of headache you don't want to deal with, well, then just stop watching right now. Because that's what Darktide is all about, man. It does this frequently, but it also does this very well. And it means it's a pretty damn challenging game. You know, let's not mince words. It's hard. Fucking hard. Well, up there's 5 difficulties, with the top 2 really requiring a 4 stack and a bunch of leveled up characters who know what the hell they're doing. The lowest difficulty settings really just put in there to be there in the first place and shouldn't be taken all that seriously. I mean, it's intended for small children and the elderly. Which means I think most people are going to either hop between the second and the third difficulty. And I'd say the gameplay loop in Darktide is manageable if you're playing with people who aren't complete idiots and know what they're doing. You can get through most encounters, even large hordes, with relative ease if you're sensible and utilize the game's mechanics. I mean, sure, every now and then the RNG gods are going to take a fat, steaming dump on you, like making you fight a mini-boss at the most inopportune times.
I did.
But having the basic skill to just manage your resources, not to mention an understanding of the combat system, is going to go a hell of a long way. Right, so you've got a melee and a ranged weapon, and there's no secret strategy to using guns here. You just kind of aim in the general direction of an enemy, and you shoot. With your melee weapon though, you've got a basic and a heavy attack, along with a dash move, blocking with the weapon, and also shoving enemies back.
Keep your distance.
Those last 3 using up your stamina, and let's just say you don't want to be running around here with the stamina depleted. Now, like I said before, I played as the Preacher for the entirety of the time I spent with this game, and like all classes, this guy or gal comes with his own set of feats, unlockable skills you get as you level up, along with his own unique ability. And for the Preacher, it's like this charge move, which instantly recharges a chunk of my toughness, and guarantees my next hit to be a critical one. He's also armed with flash grenades, which are incredibly useful when you're attacked by large hordes, and the sight of a dozen zombies shaking violently like they're having a seizure after one of these things goes off at their feet never got old to me. Regardless of who you're playing as though, you really just got to navigate these humongous environments, dealing with whatever the game throws at you, along with picking up ammo and, yes, staying alive. Ideally not being an asshole and rationing all these resources out to your buddies. All of the missions involve objectives, often just defending an area and waiting for a machine or process to complete. Periodically that process is going to stop and you're going to have to repair it, dealing with a constant influx of enemies in between. Then other missions involve destroying growths or following around servo skulls to scan the environment, along with good old-fashioned boss fights.
Oh my word.
It's even got that classic old objective of just having to survive, and memes aside, those back-to-the-wall moments when you've got no idea how long you actually have to hold out for are harrowing and pretty damn exciting. Just kind of rehashing that old Left 4 Dead formula we've all seen a bunch of times by this point. That being navigating through these preset environments in a team, dealing with randomly generated threats that are different each time, essentially making every run completely unique. The run-of-the-mill enemies usually go down in a couple of hits, but it's the special and the elite enemies who can often completely incapacitate players that require a bit of a helping hand. But even that all kind of harkens back to the old smoker, hunter, and the boomer trope from Left 4 Dead. In fact, Darktide even essentially has its own boomer, a dude running around covered in explosives who runs right up to you and leaps into your face. Holy shit! For the specials, you've got the mutants and the hounds, a big-ass monster and a big-ass dog that run right up to you and pin you down to the ground. Yeah, that's fun.
Hounds.
And then higher on the food chain are the elites, like the Crushers, the Reapers, and the Bulwarks. Crushers are giant dudes covered in armor, walking around with what looks like a block of cement on a stick. And the Bulwark carries the kind of shield that'll make Montaigne in Rainbow Six Siege green with envy. You know, basically just the kind of enemies that obviously ate their veggies growing up. You know, if their veggies were mutated, highly irradiated, and full of industrial strength steroids. And then apart from that, you've got enemies who throw bombs. There's trappers who capture you in electric nets, and a muttering nutjob armed with a flamethrower. Seems the devs also took a page out of Left 4 Dead's book here too, because all of these guys have very distinct audio cues, to the point that the game may as well give them their own entrance theme whenever one of them pops up. Now I think what's hooked me the most on Darktide is that it has a really good balance between the melee and the ranged weapons, and although you'll be mostly using axes, hammers, and eventually chainswords, you'll inevitably have to swap out to a ranged weapon at some point, be it a shotgun, assault rifle, lasgun, or a goddamn bolter. Mostly to deal with the ranged enemies, because those guys do not fuck around. Gunplay is really satisfying too. It starts off kind of basic and clunky, but then that's almost kind of like it's by design, especially earlier on when you're still leveling up. Because again, in terms of the overall story here, you've got to remember you're starting off here as someone who really should have been dead by now.
To be honest, I don't trust you. I don't think you've got the brains to handle any of this gear.
As a result, the kind of guns you're given are just hand-me-down, thrown together bits of trash that assault you with the expectation that you're going to be dead by the end of the day anyway. So if the weapon gets lost along with your corpse, well, it's no great loss. This means that earlier weapons do kinda handle like shit. However, they're still effective and they do pretty decent damage. They just might not be super accurate or have a high capacity early on. But then when you get to the higher levels, the in-game store starts selling things like chain axes and bolter guns, and that gives you a lot more options for combat. I mean, goddamn son, it wasn't until about 21 hours in when I finally got my hands on a bolter. And this thing is just insanely powerful, with a low ammo capacity and slow reload time to balance out how broken it is. That's the point when the combat starts becoming a lot more fun. And that's not even really going into the depth here you get from all the randomized weapon traits. Another big component of the game is getting better outfits. You start off wearing your prison rags and looking like you live inside a dumpster, but finishing challenges, leveling up and getting gear that makes you more than a disposable person adds a real sense of progression. Playing these kind of horde shooters online with strangers can often end in tragedy, and I think anyone who's played the Left 4 Dead series is going to have countless memories of a random player just running off from the group and swiftly being killed. So Darktide brings a pretty cool solution to this, and that's the toughness meter. So instead of just having a solitary health bar, you've also got a toughness meter, and you can think of this as kind of like a regenerating shield or armor. Whenever you take damage, instead of losing health, you now lose toughness. And then once all of that toughness is gone, you're caught with your pants around your ankles, and then you start losing your health points. But the reason this works so well though is that to fully regenerate this as fast as possible, you have to stay in proximity of the other players. It's kind of like the old strength in numbers cliche, or I don't know, maybe toughness in numbers. What it means though is that it discourages players from running off on their own and deals with it with one pretty simple mechanic. Not to mention, it also encourages team play, call-outs, and everyone working together to beat the mission. It's a really satisfying feeling making that final run to the evacuation ship as a full group, watching everyone all get on at once and narrowly escape as that final overwhelming horde was about to bear down on you. And another thing Darktide just seems to nail is that feeling you get combining a sharp or a blunt object with the flesh of whatever's on the other side of it. I mean, the ear porn you get from the combat here and chopping down hordes of enemies is pretty much just ASMR. And those chunky sound effects are just awesome. One of the main enemies are these zombie-like people afflicted with sickness by the chaos god Nurgle, and when attacking these guys with a weapon, you can even see maggots coming out of their bodies, which has to be one of the gnarliest things I think I've ever seen. Then combine all of that with some really cool animations with enemies reacting dynamically to getting whacked, and you've got some sensational combat feedback, making every hit really feel like it has a lot of weight to it. Or on the flip side, no weight. You know, letting you know your attacks aren't being that effective against whatever abomination you've come up against. Even just the feeling of taking damage. I mean, damn son, you really feel every single bullet and hit you take in this game. I really like the little spins and swipes you get when using a smaller weapon like the combat knife. Really captures the idea that your character knows what they're doing with that thing. But the highlight for me was definitely the chainsword, or the chain axe. I mean, coming across a chainsword for the first time, it was like I'd suddenly been given a second wind, and any dwindling motivation I had in regards to continually playing the game was just totally reversed. This has to be one of the most iconic 40k weapons alongside the bolter, and I'm really glad that Fat Shark have done it justice here, man. You know, being able to carve through enemies with its alternate attack mode and just do a hell of a lot of damage.
Cleansed of sin!
I do wish there was some kind of dynamic cutting system here, or at least like a preset one. You know, similar to the chainsaw kills in Doom Eternal, we could really see yourself hacking through enemies, but it's really just kind of hard to fault a chainsword, so I'll leave it there. Yes! Darktide doesn't keep throwing weapons at you either like Vermintide did, and most of the new weapons you come across you'll buy from the in-game store, again which operates on a refresh time with there apparently being over 100 guns on launch day. Yeah. Shit. They've just patched in an upgrade mechanic too, where you can upgrade the rarity of a weapon if it's got a bunch of stats you really like, meaning you're not going to be constantly swapping weapons out and can afford to spend time getting used to how they all work.
Our prayers have been answered.
And that's how they get you. You finish a mission, you level up and get some cash, maybe upgrade your weapon, then all you want to do is get right back in there and do the whole thing over again. It does all start to feel very samey after a few hours though, and you really start to feel like it's all just by the numbers by that point. The only real continuous challenge in Darktide I think comes from the ranged enemies you come up against, and hopefully you're not playing this like Left 4 Dead and more like first person Diablo, because you're going to want to save most of your bullets for these guys. Ranged enemies often just hang back with either rifles or shotguns, shooting at you from a distance and doing some heavy damage, or in the instance of coming up against a sniper, pretty much wiping your entire health bar off in a single hit.
Sniping's a good job, mate.
I love the way they swap to melee weapons when you close the gap on them. I mean, there's something so badass about them swapping out to a more viable tactic. Plus, the way they actively retreat during combat shows off the kind of self-preservation you don't normally see in horde shooters. So I'd say coming across a group of these guys is about as pants-shittingly tense as it ever gets. Healing is pretty limited here, mostly just through medkits and medical stations, so you can't afford to take all that much damage, and I'd wager when most people go down, it's gonna be from some asshole hiding on the other side of the room armed with an assault rifle. I suppose I should talk about the visuals and the performance, but before I even get into that, I've got to mention the soundtrack composed by Bespoke Post. Now I know it's not really a revelation to praise the music that guy works on, considering the majority of his stuff absolutely slaps, but holy shit man, I still feel like something needs to be said here. The range this guy has with the tracks he's worked on in Darktide, I mean, he's like the Meryl Streep of video game composers, and that music that kicks in during the boss fights is living rent-free in my head at the moment. Those ambient tracks you hear during the slower, non-combat moments in the missions also adds a great contrast to the thumping beats when you're being swarmed by dozens of enemies at once. Yeah, literally dozens. It's fucking insane how many enemies can be on screen at any time, and doubly amazing that my computer doesn't spontaneously combust. Unlike Vermintide 1 and 2, which both ran on proprietary engines, Darktide uses the Unreal Engine 4, and I know that can often be a bit of a red flag, especially if you've seen any of my recent videos, but this is thankfully one of those instances when it's the Unreal Engine in the hands of people who know what they're doing. Faffing about on the Morningstar ship in between missions, which is super chill by the way, and being able to see other players running around reminds you how you're just a small cog in a very big, corrupt and polluted machine. Comes back to what I said before, how it's really the kind of game that just makes me wish I knew more about 40k lore. But even with my limited knowledge, I can just tell that the game is oozing with authenticity and love for the source material. And even basic things like the banter between all the playable characters during missions just does a great job of pulling you into this hellhole.
Ammo! Did you just take the friggin' ammo again?
Voice acting's also really well done, and the fact the story's been written by a guy known for writing 40k novels, again gives it a real sense of authenticity. Apparently they've used a lot of the same voice actors from the Vermintide games, and you've also got a pretty extensive character creator here too, giving a much needed amount of customization to each player. The personality choices you make during this initial creator also apparently change the kind of interactions you have with other players, so the amount of combinations there would just be insane.
Shame you'll never get to prove that.
There's really nice lighting in some of the areas too, and it's this kind of level of detail with interior areas that reminds me of playing older games like Doom 3, where you can genuinely tell that someone was treating how light works in these environments like it was paint on a canvas.
Shame you'll never get to prove that.
This was also the first game I tested out after Nvidia sent me a brand spanking new RTX 4080, and most of the time it ran pretty well with all settings maxed out, you know, as you'd kind of hope. With ray tracing on though, it definitely takes a toll on performance, which again is something you'd expect I guess. Outside of the lighting looking slightly better and being able to see the reflection of your ball sack in a puddle of water, gotta say I'm still not entirely convinced that it justifies having this setting turned on, you know, considering the toll it takes on performance. The saving grace there is that DLSS option, and yeah, I know I'm kind of sounding like this is an Nvidia spot, which it isn't by the way, but that really is the saving grace because it makes such a huge improvement to how performance is. When you combine it with Nvidia Reflex, which works in tandem to reduce system lag, it does make it a pretty smooth running game. It's just kind of a shame about the load times, which can run upwards of 1 or 2 minutes, and the bugs. My god, man, the bugs.
Get me out.
The most common one I had was where items I salvaged would just keep appearing back in my inventory, even after I'd removed them multiple times. And of course, the game crashes a lot. Kind of willing to let that slide to an extent, considering the game's not even out yet, but still, the entire game crashing because you decide to change the order in which the store lists items is pretty damn dumb. That probably won't mean much to most of Darktide's fanbase, considering most of them I think are going to be here for a long, long time, by which point all this crap's probably going to be patched out. And I guess that kind of brings me on to the final point of the video, that being, you know, what's the end game? Well, like Vermintide, the ultimate value I think you're going to get out of this thing just depends on how much time you want to sink into it. With 4 classes and a bunch of missions to choose from on multiple difficulties with a bunch of modifiers, along with constantly getting bigger and better weapons, cosmetics and challenges to unlock, I do think they've justified that reasonable price tag. Each class even has multiple challenges alone. I mean, for the Zealot, I had to kill a mutant in a specific way, or throw a flash grenade over 40 meters to stun a sniper, you know, stuff like that. And they aren't like instantly achievable, you know, taking multiple attempts. That is a good thing because it encourages longevity and replayability, but the question is, are you going to be into it? Darktide, a lot like Vermintide, feels like it's mostly catering for that 5% of its player base who are going to happily sink hundreds if not thousands of hours into this thing, doing the same dozen or so missions over and over. But I mean, to me it's kind of like even once you've found your groove, you're really just replaying the same missions over and over with all these randomized elements. Changing the class you're playing as does change the approach, but it's still the same result at the end of the day. And yes, that loop is fun and addictive as hell to a point, but eventually it's going to be impossible to just not lose interest, even a little bit.
Now get lost. Come back when you've survived a few more missions.
Does that make it bad? Well, no it doesn't. And yeah, I'm sure they'll add in new missions and content and story in the coming months and years, but I don't know man, I'd be lying if I said my interest wasn't starting to wane around that 20-hour mark. There are a few other minor areas I think the game is lacking in. Like the absence of a proper scoreboard at the end of missions just seems kinda stupid to me. Not being able to see the tally for all your individual kills, especially considering how detailed the scoreboard was in Vermintide 2. You also can't play solo matches in the current version, you're forced to play online all the time, which also means anyone can join your game, and yeah, speaking of that too, it's also a live service game. Still though, destroying heretics with a chainsword and a bolter has never been more fun, and for $60 you're definitely going to get your value here. It's just in regards to each individual person as to how much value that's actually going to be.
There he goes. Oh, you, buddy. Oh, you.